And my talk today is a post-mortem about my most recent indie game that I released last fall called The Hex. I'm going to talk about the game and specifically the design goals I had when I was creating these 6 genres that are within The Hex, and how they worked out and how they sometimes backfired, and then in the end, how it all played out. So because this talk is pretty long, I can give a little bit of background about myself as a developer and my sort of indie career. So my company is called Daniel Mullins Games. It's named after me because I do nearly everything involved in it. Like on the business side, I'm doing, the marketing, the whatever you want to call it. I edit the trailers for the Steam page, all the rest. And when it comes to the development, the only thing I don't do is the audio. I have a very talented composer and sound designer named Jonas Senzel who does the music and sound. And he did that for my last game, Pony Island, and then my most recent one, The Hex. And also in The Hex, I did contract a 3D artist because the game is mostly in 2D, but there are some 3D parts near the end. So my indie dev career kind of starts in 2013. I was doing a degree in computer science at a Canadian university, and as a project in one of my courses, we were tasked with actually making a game. This was extremely exciting for me because I had dabbled in game development when I was younger. I made some very basic Flash games, but I'd never made anything substantial, and now I had an opportunity to do that. There was this guy in my class who was just kind of an acquaintance, but we teamed up and we made something really cool. And we were so excited about this that we decided that summer we would work together and make some more games. So we made some mobile games together. We made 2 games over the summer, and we're working on a 3rd one, and we kind of ran out of time and never finished it. And that brought me to kind of the end of my degree after I graduated the next year, and I got my first job in the games industry as a programmer. As the games industry goes, things are chaotic, and 6 months later, the studio was kind of bankrupt and everyone was laid off. So I took this freedom that I now had with my bank account replenished and some time on my hands to work on a Kickstarter and take my next stab at the indie career. I worked on the game for about 3 months to make a demo. I spent a month preparing the Kickstarter page, and then for a month I slowly watched it die before my eyes. And it wasn't funded, and if it wasn't clear, the indie games that I made with my friend weren't very successful in making money either. But the next year I got another job in the games industry, and I held it for longer this time, about a year, a bit over a year. And this time I decided that while I worked at my job, I would also continue trying to make indie games. It was not easy, but in my spare time in the early morning and on weekends, I worked on this game called Pony Island. It was originally a game jam game, and I slowly realized it had some potential, and so I squeezed extra hours out of my day to work on it until eventually I got to the very beginning of 2016 when I released it. And up to this point, I was starting to get some clues that people were interested in it, like there was a lot of wish lists just based on the trailer, but when I released it, the response was really staggering. On day 1, PewDiePie played it, and that prompted all the other major YouTubers to pick it up. Got great reviews, got picked up by all the major news outlets, so this was huge for me. It basically allowed me to make my indie career. I was successful in reaching funding, so now I had the runway to make another game full-time. So then I was left with an uncomfortable problem, a good type of problem, but a problem nonetheless. I didn't really know what to do next, and I felt like an immense pressure to live up to Pony Island and all the praise it had received. So in a panic, I started working on my next game. A weird pie-based combat game, actually. I only worked on this for a month, but this was what I started working on. It was kind of a turn-based RPG with roguelike elements, kind of similar to Darkest Dungeon, if you know that game. And it had this weird, like whimsical 20th century war kind of theme. And I don't think there was anything necessarily wrong with it. I just got scared, and I felt the pressure of living out to Pony Island. So after a month, I was like, oh, not good enough, scrap it. So then again, I was left wondering what to do next. And I was kind of in this mode of like, okay, what if this was a game? What if that was a game? And then I saw this movie, The Hateful Eight by Quentin Tarantino, and I'm a fan of his other movies. I liked this movie too. And so that night, as I was going to sleep, I was kind of thinking, what if this was a game? And I was kind of thinking about this concept that Tarantino didn't necessarily invent of like a murder mystery where all the characters are stuck in together and they have like pasts that intertwine with each other, and there's all this intrigue, and I thought that was really cool. So I was thinking, what if that was a game? And so this basic concept came to me as I was falling asleep that night. I thought it would be a murder mystery. The suspects are video game characters because this is a video game. Each character would have a hidden past similar to the movie, and then because it's a game again, each past would play out in a totally different game genre. And this is the concept that I kind of ran with. It was going to be a lot of work, and it was a lot of work. About 2.5 years of working nearly full-time, but at the end of that, this is what I came to. This is the release trailer of the game. I'm not sure if the translation is actually translating the text. This might be totally gibberish to some people, but hopefully there's enough English speakers to understand it. Yeah, so it all went by pretty fast, but that'll give you a very basic sense of the game I ended up with. But the talk is about how I ended up there. So I'll go back in time to the beginning of development. This is the first thing I could find when I went digging back for old material to use for this talk. It's a sketch I did way back, I guess it would be in 2016, and I was kind of trying to just draw like roughly what the inn that this all takes place in would look like. And just doodling this helped me just get a basic sense of like the structure of the inn, of course, but also the order things would unlock and like what areas you'd explore and so on. The next major thing I did was do a visual prototype, and I used that weird Pi-base game as a basis for the art style. And many people start with a gray box or a white box, and the idea is you want to prototype your gameplay before you spend all the time making the art and the sound and so on. This doesn't work so well for me, really for reasons of motivation. When I wake up in the morning and start working on the game, it has to be something already compelling visually and something that appears, at least in some way, to be what the final game is going to look like. So for me, the art has to be in from the very beginning, and that's just a personal thing. But I think it might be true for other people. So if you find that when you start a gray box level and it just you're not very excited about it, try just putting some art in. Who cares if you have to go back and change it later? This isn't feasible for everyone. And then the next thing I did was kind of work on the basic mechanics in the inn. It's point and click and switching between characters. So I was using Unity, of course. I had used Unity in Pony Island, and I'd been using it for years at this point, so it was sort of a no-brainer. It's never let me down, and it still hasn't. So yeah, it worked out very well. So the original plan that I was going off of was that you'd be able to freely switch between those 6 characters that you saw. You'd approach their stories in any order, and then there'd be a dynamic story based on the order that you played them in. And like, this sounded cool on paper, but when I actually got to making it, I was so boggled by the task that I ended up just getting overwhelmed and trying to simplify it. So I ended up scrapping this, and then this is the actual plan that I went with, and this is how the game plays out. So you're in this old inn, and the bartender just told you that there's a murder, and there's going to be a murder, and one of you is planning it. And then you control a character, and the bartender is this kind of old, curmudgeonly guy who's a central plot character, but also sort of like an NPC quest giver. So he'll tell you to go do something, and then suspiciously every time you do, something bad happens. In the case of Super Weasel Kid, he goes to get the key, and then he falls through the floorboards and like falls down to the sewer. And then whatever traumatic thing happens to the character triggers a memory for them. At this point, you play their memory, which for each character is a different game genre. And once you're done that, you go back to the inn, you switch characters, and then repeat. For the most part, this is kind of the formula. But I discovered early on that the real meat of the game was these flashbacks where you would play all these different types of games, and then you'd kind of subvert the game as you went. Just to summarize and give an idea of what these flashbacks were, in case the trailer wasn't completely clear, there's the platformer. He basically in the vein of Super Mario, but the character kind of looks like maybe a mix of Sonic and Crash Bandicoot. He starts off in this like perfect game that is beloved by the fans, but then for the sequel, some developer hubris comes in and there's combat added and people don't like that and it's kind of got mixed reviews. And then for the last installment in his franchise, it's a remake of the original and it's given off to a third party and it's all buggy and everyone hates it. There's Bryce the Fighter. He starts out in a cooking game, but his kind of character is transferred over to a fighting game where he has to navigate the politics of buffs and nerfs and get himself so buffed that he's overpowered so he can be banned and return to his cooking game. There's Shondrel the Sorceress. She's in an RPG kind of similar to Final Fantasy, but the twist is she's trying to destroy the world rather than save it. There's Rust, a post-apocalypse survivor. In appearance, it's sort of like Fallout, but the gameplay is more like Advance Wars or Fire Emblem. It's a turn-based tactics game. And the twist is that cheats and mods are applied to his game to the point that he no longer recognizes it, and it starts to make him go insane. There's the Space Marine. It's a top-down sci-fi shooter. And he's originally seen in the RPG as a sort of soldier companion, and then later on he's moved to the top-down shooter where he becomes a sort of like grizzled, PTSD-ridden veteran of this horrible game. And then there's the first-person perspective. It's sort of a walking simulator / puzzle game, and this character is enigmatic and not much is known about them. So I'm going to go over the design goals for each of these flashback segments. These aren't things that I necessarily penned at the very beginning and like I need to hit all these goals. They're things that I kind of realized as I developed the game, and by the end of it I wanted each flashback to meet these goals. So I'll go into them in more detail, but the first one is an even mix of head genres and hand genre, a uniform control scheme for all 6. They would have quick onboarding of game mechanics. They would maintain the spirit of the genre that they're coming from. There would be a twist in each one, and the whole thing needs to all feel cohesive. I don't want it to feel like a collection of 6 games. I want it to feel like ever-changing mechanics in one unified experience. So to go over the head and hands thing, one of the images is missing for some reason, but that's okay. It's just a basic distinction that I saw in a book about game design called The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. It's just a simple way to divide gameplay paradigms. On the one hand, you've got stuff that's like thinking ahead, puzzles like an RPG or turn-based tactics, and on the other hand, you've got reflex-based manual dexterity stuff like a shooter, a fighter, or a platformer. So I thought by mixing between these two and alternating, it would be very refreshing for the player to constantly have this new gameplay paradigm presented. The uniform control scheme was important because I want you to be able to pick up these games, and the Hex as a whole is 6 hours or maybe a bit less. So you're only spending about 45 minutes or so in each one of these, and I don't want you to be guessing at the control scheme or having to learn something complicated every time. So I want it to be uniform across the whole game, and in some cases this is very simple. You might guess by looking at the top-down shooter that you move the character with WASD, you move the mouse to aim the gun, and you click the mouse to shoot. And so this translated very well. And in the RPG, it was a similar case where you'd pick a spell with the mouse and you'd target an enemy, and then the spell would shoot off and hit that enemy. In some cases, it was a lot harder, though. For instance, in the fighting game, trying to map this uniform control scheme on took a lot of work and a lot of iteration. Fighting games tend to have complex control schemes. Sometimes they have 2 types of attack, like a heavy or a light attack, a ultimate attack, jumping, ducking, all the rest. So I tried to distill the fighting game formula down to its simplest parts and just have one type of strike that could go in 3 directions, high, middle, or low. And corresponding to this, I would have a defense for each direction. And then, so the A and D would move you left and right. Simple enough. Up and down would jump and duck. But the innovation I found was aiming your strike based on the mouse position. In the tutorial, this is shown very clearly with these lines, and you might think that without the lines, you'd be guessing. But I think it works because the characters in this section all have similar proportions. So when your mouse is above their neck, you're always punching up, and when it's below their waist, you're punching down. So this ended up working once it was taught to the player, unintuitive at first. And then blocking was also a bit sticky. It's familiar with fighting game players because in Street Fighter and many other games, if you are walking backwards, you'll automatically block if a strike is thrown at you. But if you don't play fighting games, it's not at all intuitive and it's kind of weird. But because I had so few buttons, I ended up adopting that. And so it was also something I had to really explicitly teach, and as a result, it was harder to do. So on the plus side, I maintained the controls paradigm with this section, which I thought was extremely important. But on the downside, this is a pretty unfamiliar control scheme, and no other fighting game I've ever seen has worked like this, probably for good reason. And also, as a result of that, it was the longest tutorial in the game. So the quick onboarding of mechanics definitely ties into the control scheme. Because of the uniform control scheme, I can teach things faster. Like I mentioned, because the shooter is so intuitive with this control scheme, I didn't even have to have a tutorial for this section. I just throw you in, and because it comes later in the game and you've already got your hands on those buttons, you kind of just know what to do. I can also rely on players bringing in their kind of preconceptions of these genres. Because the Hex is no one's first game. It's quite clearly like referential of other games and a game about games. No one goes onto Steam and says, "Oh, I've never played a game before. Maybe let's check out this one." It just doesn't happen. So everyone knows what a platformer is who plays this game. So I can rely on that, and I can also avoid kind of tutorializing the platformer section. I wouldn't ever take this for granted, of course. I play tested a lot, and the playtesting bore this out. But for the most part, my assumption here was true. In other cases, it wasn't. I actually thought more gamers were familiar with this control scheme seen in Advanced Wars and Fire Emblem, most famously, of like selecting a unit and then moving them and then attacking with them. I played a lot of these games when I was younger, so I guess I was biased in that way, but I actually found that people who played a ton of games would approach this and not have any idea. So I had to do a more explicit tutorial there. One trick I did when I did need a tutorial was I try to mask it in the story. So at least when you're doing the tutorial, it feels like this section of gameplay has a purpose and is contributing to the narrative rather than just you sitting there and me being a teacher telling you how to play. So in this RPG, there is a tutorial, but it's also part of the story. There's this annoying tutorial giver character who treats you a bit too much like a baby. You're probably familiar with this in some games. And then you actually end up killing the character as part of the tutorial. And this is not just a gag, but a plot point that comes up again and again in the future. So I wanted to maintain the spirit of each of these. So because I want you to bring in your kind of baggage and understanding of these genres, I want them to at least appear to be the genre that I say they are. I can't adapt them so heavily that it's no longer a platformer, it's just the Hex, and it has to also still appear to be a fighting game too. So in some cases, this was easy, and in some cases, it was hard. I did struggle with the RPG. If you're familiar with Final Fantasy, you're familiar with kind of the mechanic of random encounters where an enemy will jump you and you'll have to fight them. And you do this sort of willingly in Final Fantasy because you're invested in your character and then leveling up and everything. But when you're only playing this section in the Hex for 45 minutes, it's kind of awkward to throw a bunch of these encounters at you. So one way I tackled this was have the characters be aware of flaws in the level. So in one spot, there's this huge circuitous route up this mountain, and you have to fight like a million kobolds on the way there. So that's what Final Fantasy would do. But in the Hex, I wanted to have the critical path be much shorter. So there's a hole in the wall collider where the characters just walk through to the dragon, and they talk about this and discuss it. So only people who want some sort of hardcore experience or are streamers and trying to amuse their audience will actually take the long way around. But if you do, there's an Easter egg reward for doing so. There's got to be a twist was a goal that kind of is a stayover from Pony Island. I felt that alongside it being amusing for me to shock and surprise characters, it was also kind of expected after Pony Island. So I wanted each game to have something weird going on that you wouldn't have guessed going in. Some of them are just kind of surface level. In the platformer, you jump on Steam reviews, and the reviews are of the game that you're playing. And this kind of tells that story of, in the first one, all his fans love him, and then the second one is kind of mixed, and by the last one, it's all downvotes and negative reviews. Similarly, in the RPG, there's this Twitch chat running along the side that kind of heckles you and tells you how to level up your character. And for the most part, it's just kind of a gag, but in some parts it ties into the gameplay. Specifically, there's a riddle battle where the Sphinx is asking you riddles and someone in the chat is spoiling the game by telling you the answers, but you actually have to listen to the heckler at one point because the questions get so convoluted that you couldn't actually know the right answer. One twist that I was really proud of that really tied in strongly with the gameplay was this sort of Game Shark-esque interface that you see in the turn-based tactics. It's like you have cheat commands while you're playing, but the game remains challenging at the same time. This evolved a lot as the game went on. It was one thing that was constantly under renovation and changing based on player feedback. Originally, you could only activate one cheat at a time, but then by experimentation, I found that being able to combine them was really interesting, so I let you turn on two at once. Originally, they were all introduced at once, and kind of in the spirit of the Game Shark, if you got a Game Shark cheat system, you wouldn't unlock the cheats one by one. You'd get them all at once. But I found that if I actually did that, the player would be kind of overburdened by all that information, so I had to drip feed them in the end. And then originally it had a lack of affordances. It didn't have the checkboxes, and it was harder to understand which ones were turned on and off. So in the end, I ended up with these levels that you cheated, and you felt like you were cheating because you'd get extraordinary abilities like infinite movement or infinite damage, but they were actually still a challenge on the designs of the levels. And lastly, the most important goal I had was that I wanted everything to feel cohesive, not a collection of games like Mario Party, but all one game where the mechanics are switching up and things are so fluid, but you don't feel like I've played one and I play a different one and they're totally different experiences. So one thing that was sort of obvious to tie them together was having the narrative through line, which was always my plan. There's, of course, the murder mystery that you learn about at the beginning, where someone in the inn is planning a murder. But then there's also some lore and backstory, where this mysterious developer by the name of Lionel Snill keeps getting mentioned, and it might be that he's the developer of all these games. Something that I had a lot of fun with was reoccurring characters that appear in one genre and then prop up later in the weirdest spots. So like this grimy tutorial guy from the platformer ends up being the shopkeeper in the RPG, for instance, and I get to draw him in different art styles, and it's kind of funny when you first meet him. There's like the janitor from the Sacred Temple in the RPG who ends up being the sniper character in the shooter. Another thing that's somewhat obvious but was still very effective in tying the experience together was aesthetic choices like the graphics and sound. I have no art background. I have no background in color theory, so what I did was just use an online palette generator to make a basic color palette, created some variations of it, and then applied it very liberally all over the game. I wasn't obviously adhering strictly to the palette because it's so limited, but I found that even by doing this in a sort of sloppy way, I ended up with somewhat of a uniform color profile for the game. And when I had the 3D art done, I gave the 3D artist the color palette, and I think he did a great job of sticking to it. Music was obviously very important. I would have kind of melodic callbacks to earlier parts in the game where you know a melody from the platformer, but then you'd hear it in the background later at appropriate parts, and sound effects that kind of created a uniform soundscape for the game. And then one thing that was very difficult to do at some points was have recurring gameplay elements and gameplay elements that actually combined the systems together. So on the simpler side, I wanted certain interactions to be consistent throughout all of them. Like if you're picking something up, you move the mouse over and you click it. Because you always use the same control scheme, this wasn't so hard to pull off. But it does add some less of a cognitive load on the player to learn all this. Some really tricky stuff was doing the merging of gameplay systems. So like as an example, there's a battle in the RPG where a character from the fighting game appears and you have to use your fighting game skills in tandem with your RPG spells to defeat him. Another example of this is in the top-down shooter. You go through these weird portals where you end up turning into a pixel character and playing the RPG, but you bring your gun into the battle and you have gun-based spells. So to tie together the kind of idea of the experience and my goals, I'll talk a bit about the inn, which was sort of the hub that all of these flashbacks would launch off from. This is a screenshot of it early on in development, and I found it was just a process of filling in the blanks and adding stuff everywhere until it felt like something that you could kind of delve into and poke around in, and you might find some secrets. So I just kept on adding stuff till like the day before I launched. I tried to have puzzles before each of the flashbacks, and I tried my best to have them somewhat foreshadow the flashback game genre to come, but in some cases this wasn't possible, so I did sort of like foreshadowing with the items and graphics. Like in this scene, it's kind of like a stacking puzzle, and it has nothing to do with the upcoming turn-based tactics, but the items that you're moving around and stacking are foreshadowing some of the events to come. And I did a similar thing with non-interactive items, like this wanted poster that appears to have the top of the Space Marine's helmet in it, which is foreshadowing before and then afterward a kind of a thing that didn't go quite as well in its entirety was this collectible coin system that I put in quite close to the end, actually. I wanted to encourage that exploration in the inn where you'd poke around and hopefully find something interesting. And I wanted it to be more substantial than just like, oh, that's cool. I wanted you to actually find something and have that dopamine rush when you found something. So I hid all these coins around, and you could collect the coins, and then there'd be vending machines that required coins. If you put the coins in the vending machine, enough of them, rather than a soda dropping, a doorknob drops, and it's actually a secret door into this back room with kind of lore secrets and interesting information about the characters. But the reason why I think this didn't work so well was that the players didn't find this ultimate reward for finding all the coins all that satisfying, and I don't necessarily blame them. There's no like final boss or anything that you can achieve by finding all the coins. Just kind of like lore background and story elements, and people were left wondering, is there something more? So that brings me to what else went wrong in the game. Namely, like just a mountain of bugs and polish problems that never got fixed until the very end. Yeah, there was some weird. This is mostly like goofy bugs that I had during development they didn't actually make it very far into the game, but there were tons of stuff that did. Animation polish problems that never got fixed even to this day. This is my Trello board. This is my Trello board now. After the game's been released for like 6 months, and I'll probably never fix half this stuff because there was just so much of it. You should have seen it during the beta. It was gargantuan, and this is just like there's way more of these lists going left and right. There's just so much for one person to handle. Another place where the game, I think, suffered was in that whole thing where I was trying to stay true to the genre but try to wrap it up quickly. And I think if you read a lot of reviews, you'll notice that they mention certain parts of the game dragging. I think it's because these sections got bloated with all this stuff that I didn't really need. Like in the RPG, there's level up options for your character, and there's all these items, and it just you're only in it for about 45 minutes, so you don't really need all this stuff to really get the experience. So that brings me to the beta. I didn't do anything revolutionary here, but I did find what I did was very effective, probably to the point where like if I had released the game before doing the beta, I would have been embarrassed about it now, because the game improved so much in these couple months leading up to the launch based on player feedback. So the first thing I did was put out a tweet asking for people to help beta test the game. And I got quite a few responses, luckily, because I had enough of a Twitter following. If I didn't, I would probably go to forums or Reddit to get playtesters. So once I had people's emails, I compiled a Google spreadsheet that had their email, their name, what version of the beta they were on. This is important because if they say, oh, I've had this bug and I've already fixed it, if they're on an old version, then I'm confident, sure, I've already fixed it. But if they're on the latest version, then maybe my fix didn't work. So I had to keep track of that. A Steam key, so I could keep track of who had received which key, notes, and how they wanted to be credited. I had a email spam program that I've been using for years to spam employers with my resume, but I repurposed it for sending out beta invites to all these people. Unity was extremely useful for me in running the beta. This is the stuff I'll mention is probably not too crazy and probably stuff you could implement in a custom engine, and I'm sure Unreal has stuff like it, but I was really impressed with how quickly I was able to implement these things. Like in a minute, you can just flick a switch and all errors, warnings, crashes will be sent to a nice little web portal where you can view them and aggregate them, and it'll have stack traces, it'll have people's system information and more. It's great for debugging. Similarly, there's something you can download from Unity and put it in your game, probably take you 20 minutes, and you've got a bug report window where they can hit a UI button or do a keyboard shortcut. Window will pop up, instantly take a screenshot. They can describe their problem and send it off to you where it's presented to you nicely in a web portal and aggregated. So this helped me solve so many bugs that if someone just emailed me saying, this happens at this time, I probably wouldn't have had the information I needed to solve it. But with this, I could just crank out bug fixes. I did a qualitative questionnaire at the end of the game. So once you finish the beta, you'd get a screen saying, thanks so much for playing. If you hit enter now, we'll launch a window right out of the game into your browser, and it'll be a questionnaire. Please, if you have time, fill it out. So what I wanted to do with this was keep the questions as minimal as possible. I didn't want to daunt people with the amount of questions. I didn't want people to open up the questionnaire and go, this is too much, I don't have time. If there are a few questions, they're more likely to complete it. And I also wanted a few questions because I wanted long-form, detailed answers rather than just a sentence to get through all the questions. So the first question I asked was really helpful. I don't hear a lot about people playtesting the narrative. You kind of often write a story and that's that. But I found that by asking if they had questions regarding the story or timeline or world, they would often have major confusions that I didn't realize people weren't understanding. So a moment that was supposed to have emotional impact would kind of fall flat because they didn't understand some character or something leading up to it. So I improved the story a lot this way. The next two questions didn't have a huge impact. The one about the especially confused or frustrated was very useful to me, to the point where I was getting so many common responses about certain parts that I was kind of crossing off the worst parts of the game one by one. And so I improved the experience so much by doing that. And then the technical issues and accessibility issues, I learned a lot. Some things people would tell me that I didn't get a bug report for, so I was able to fix bugs that way. And I also added and improved subtitles in a section based on the question about accessibility. So I got to fall of 2018. It was October 16th, and I was ready to release the Hex, so I did. It had a lukewarm response, at least relative to Pony Island. I had good reviews, but not a ton of them. I had a very nice review from Rock Paper Shotgun. I had Kotaku writing about the game. But for the most part, it didn't quite live up in terms of hype or sales to Pony Island. This might be attributed to Pony Island playing, or PewDiePie playing Pony Island on day one and all the YouTubers who hopped on that train. But in the end, it was about a fifth of Pony Island's revenue in the first week. But things did pick up a bit. I had some major YouTubers pick up the game, and I saw things improve a little bit through that. And I also had Jim Sterling do 2 videos on the game, one a Let's Play and one a Game of the Year sort of video. And I was interested to see that despite his following not being as big as some of the other YouTubers, they were much more dedicated and interesting in purchasing the game. Because when he did a video, I would see a huge sales spike where I didn't from other YouTubers who might even have a greater following than his. And it had great reviews on Steam, so I was very proud of that too. So a few weeks after the release, I saw this forum post, and this was something I was expecting because in Pony Island, I had run this sort of ARG where I would leave little things dangling in the game that didn't quite add up and hopefully titillate the players to wonder if there was something they were missing. And when they caught on to that, I would start to add secrets into the game, a sort of breadcrumb trail through patches after the game was released. And I was hoping to do this again with the Hex, but to an even greater degree. So that brings me to Beneath the Surface, the secret ending of the Hex that was actually found in a totally different game on Steam, a secret thing that people could only find by following this crazy breadcrumb trail. So this is, if you'll bear with me, how you would find out about this secret. There's a fishing rod in the RPG. It's out of the way. Maybe 1 in 10 players would find it. There's a chance of you fishing up a secret message in a bottle. Now, if you go to this weird computer thing that's even harder to find, you probably would only find out about it by reading on the forums. It duplicates items. If you use it to duplicate your message in a bottle, it turns into this cryptic message. Now, another thread, there's this character called Wizero. If you save him, he'll appear later. And he mentions something about a cipher, and you'll see the cipher.cipher text in weird spots in the game. Put these together, you make a file called cipher.cipher in your save folder with this cryptic message in it. You're about halfway there. So you have to fill in the X's. Some of it's based on this common message that's found throughout the game. Some of it's this weird convoluted way of interpreting the achievements, which the community had to find. And then the last one is a reference to Pony Island. If you put that all together, and you do it correctly, his gobbledygook will be decrypted into a message that mentions a fishing game. And sure enough, if you go on Steam and you search for fishing games, there's one that came out around the same time that all these clues were coming out, and it had a name of the developer that was relevant to the story of the hex. And in the fishing game, if you play it for about an hour, you'll come across an old locket that has a similarly cryptic message. If you put the same cipher file in this game, it'll decrypt the message and it'll tell you how to find the secret ending. The actual game, the fishing game, was something I decided to do based on this old Game Jam game I had done years ago. And I had always had a soft spot for this game because it was one of my first Game Jam entries. And I wanted to see years later if I could remake it and kind of improve it and see how far I'd come in terms of my skills. So that was the motivation for doing the fishing game. But then I also tied in like lore and story hints about the hex into it as well. The way I communicated all this to the players was very subtly. This was another thing that I'd done during Pony Island, where I would do these patches that had legitimate bug fixes and legitimate improvements, but also I would say minor bug fixes. And this was kind of a wink to certain people that what I had added had furthered the secret trail. And I was happy to see that news outlets picked up the story of the secret ending. Both Kotaku and Rock Paper Shotgun did great articles kind of detailing kind of the novelty of how the secret ending is found in a totally different game. I won't spoil what the secret ending actually is, but if you want to go online and read about it or find a YouTube video, feel free to. Thank you very much. That's my talk. It might be a little early, so if you got questions, thanks. I just clapped for myself.
If you have some questions to Daniel, you can ask them.
Hey, yeah. First, thanks for amazing speech. I got interested. Basically, the entire game is parts split. The game splits in part in different games, so
yeah.
they combine with the same controls to make a whole piece. And have you ever found yourself thinking that one part of a game could be better by adding a few features, but that would make other part bleak in comparison, make it less well sculptured and not as feature rich? And how have you found balance between these parts to not make like one interesting, but not make the player's favorite? Like everyone likes this part, but no one likes this part. Mm-hmm. Have you made that balancing on a stage of game designing or closer to the testing?
It was a process that I think happened throughout the entire development, constantly iterating on the parts. So I would do what you were saying, where like, oh, I have an idea for this part, I'll add it, and now that's the best part, and everyone likes that, and now the rest of the game seems weak in comparison. But then I'd have to say, okay, well, I'd rather still keep that, so let's go to the weaker parts and improve them. And it's kind of this process of upgrading all the bits of it over time until they all level out at the end, hopefully. They didn't, because there are parts in the game that everyone says is their favorite, and there are parts of the game that everyone says is their least favorite, or at least a lot of people do. That doesn't bother me so much. I just want the entire experience to be as good as it can, so I wouldn't hold back on a cool idea just because that part would become favored. But yeah, I was always adding to the game and iterating on it. I was playtesting throughout the entire time. It was 2.5 years, and like from the first 6 months, I had people playing it. I would bring them a specific part and say, play it, watch them take notes. So the way I work is not usually like planning it early and seeing how it plays out. It's just a constant process of adding and polishing and refining.
Hi, Daniel. I'm here.
Oh, hey.
Thank you for your talk. Previously, you mentioned that you had an Easter egg and you had an RG game related to the other game. And in your opinion, what are the other important points that are what are other points that are important to building up the hype among streamers community for the game, and how to make the game entertaining for stream viewers?
I think the answer to this, I'll talk more about Pony Island, because I think Pony Island was more successful in doing this. I got way more streamers and YouTubers for that game. And I think part of it is that YouTubers and streamers are engaging because of their reactions to what's happening. So if something shocking happens, they'll go whoa, and they'll usually play it up like to the nth degree. Like you'll see them and you'll be like, okay, you're hamming it up a bit, pal, but that's fine. So the more you give them an opportunity to go, whoa, what's that? I think the better, and the more likely they are to pick it up, and the more genuine their shock and surprise is, the less they have to fake it and ham it up. So I would say having moments of shock and surprise, I think, really works in your favor, and they'll watch someone else play the game, I think, to vet it, and they'll see, okay, this part I could do something funny, and that part I could do something funny, and then I guess also in your marketing materials and the trailer, the name of the game, the description, you would want to indicate too that this is in a league of games that's shocking and surprising. I think in Pony Island particularly, just to go into a bit of detail there, it's called Pony Island, but it's really this game about escaping a demonic arcade machine. So just that on its face is surprising and weird, and that's exactly what I think YouTubers and streamers are looking for.
Okay, I have my question.
Cool.
As you mentioned, you wanted to make cohesive gameplay between 6 different genres.
Mm-hmm.
Which problems did you face, and how you coped these problems?
So the problems involved in just the whole thing of like making the 6 different ones?
Okay, but how you balanced them to make those games are very different, speaking about pace and gameplay, and how you balance them.
Right. I guess balance is weird, because when I think about balance, my first thought is like multiplayer games where it has to be fair for all the players, and you don't feel like if you're playing Overwatch, this one character always wins. But I guess in terms of a single player game, balance is kind of different. I suppose there's stuff like in the RPG you have different spells, and if one spell was just way better than all the rest of them, then you would always use it, and that would kind of prevent you from picking some of the more interesting options. So it would be on a game-by-game basis, but I think mostly this was addressed by playtesting and constant iteration. In the case of for instance, the tactics game where you have that cheat console, I did look at the cheats and see, is this one too good? Are people always using this one? So I would both try to balance that by tweaking numbers and making it so players pick all the options evenly as much as possible, and also trying to craft scenarios where some ability is useful and another one isn't, so that you don't end up with some gameplay option that's always the best pick. So I think, the short answer would be just constantly iterating on player feedback and your own intuitions.